A billionaire sat alone in a Manhattan courtroom, abandoned by 12 lawyers who'd rather destroy their careers than defend him. The prosecutors were circling like wolves, the judge was minutes away, and the only person who could save him was mopping the floor outside. In 3 hours, a cleaning woman in a faded gray uniform would walk into that courtroom and speak 4 words that would shake the American legal system to its core. I will defend him. But the world didn't know yet that this janitor, this invisible black woman everyone ignored, had once made Supreme Court justices rise to their feet. They didn't know she'd been erased from history for knowing too much. What would make a woman who lost everything risk it all for a man the whole world wanted to see burn? Evelyn Washington arrived at the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse at 4:47 a.m. every morning, her footsteps the first to break the pre-dawn silence. At 53, her dark skin bore the lines of someone who had weathered storms that would break most people. Her uniform, always pressed, never quite fitting right, hung on a frame that had once commanded boardrooms and courtrooms across the nation. The other janitors called her Ghost because she moved through the building like a shadow, never speaking unless spoken to, never lingering where the lawyers gathered. Her hair, once styled in power suits worth thousands, now pulled back in a simple bun beneath a faded blue bandana. In her cart's bottom drawer, hidden beneath industrial cleaners and worn rags, lay a small leather folder. Inside, a photograph from 1995, a young black woman in judicial robes, standing beside Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall himself. The inscription, barely visible after years of handling, read, "To Evelyn, the future of American justice. Never let them dim your light." But that light had been extinguished long ago, or so everyone believed. As she mopped the floors outside courtroom 318, she overheard the conversations of million-dollar attorneys who never bothered to lower their voices around the help. They spoke of precedents she had set, cases she had won, never knowing the architect of those victories was cleaning their coffee spills. The morning of November 15th started like any other. Evelyn arrived early, began her routine, avoided eye contact. But something was different in the air. A tension that made even the marble walls seem to lean in, listening. In courtroom 318, Richard Kensington III, pharmaceutical billionaire and lightning rod for public hatred, sat alone at the defendant's table. His legal team, all 12 of them, had walked out an hour before trial, their reputations more valuable than their client's freedom. The judge would arrive in 2 hours. The prosecutors smelled blood. And Evelyn Washington, pushing her cart past the courtroom doors, paused for just a moment longer than usual. She watched him through the narrow window, this man who commanded boardrooms and influenced governments, now reduced to shuffling papers he clearly didn't understand. His Armani suit couldn't hide the tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders curved inward like a man already defeated. Evelyn had seen that posture before, in her own reflection, 28 years ago, when the world she'd built came crashing down. The parallel struck her with unexpected force, though she pushed the thought away. This wasn't her fight. She'd learned the cost of fighting other people's battles. 28 years ago, Evelyn Washington wasn't pushing mops. She was pushing boundaries. At 25, she'd become the youngest black woman to argue before the Supreme Court. By 30, she'd built a practice that challenged the very foundations of corporate law, taking on pharmaceutical giants who poisoned communities and walked away counting profits. The media called her the conscience of corporate America, a title that made boardrooms nervous and communities hopeful. Her weapon wasn't just the law. It was an encyclopedic memory that could recall every precedent, every loophole, every contradictory testimony from cases decades old. But power has a way of protecting itself. In 1996, Evelyn took on Pharmacon Industries for contaminating groundwater in 12 predominantly black neighborhoods across Georgia. The case should have been straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies heartbreaking. Children with rare cancers, mothers burying babies, fathers watching their families waste away. Evelyn had them cornered. Then, one October morning, she arrived at her office to find FBI agents with warrants. Someone had planted evidence of embezzlement, judicial bribery, witness tampering. The charges were so perfectly orchestrated that even her closest allies distanced themselves overnight. The trial that followed wasn't about justice, it was about destruction. Pharmacon's lawyers, led by a young prosecutor named Mitchell Crawford, painted her as a radical who'd gotten too greedy, too ambitious. They used her success against her, her confidence as evidence of corruption. The black community she'd fought for was split, some standing by her, others wondering if she'd sold them out. When the verdict came down, disbarment, though not conviction, Evelyn didn't fight. She'd seen what they could do, how deep their reach went. More importantly, she'd received a message delivered to her home, photographs of her 14-year-old nephew at school, at basketball practice, sleeping in his bed. The message was clear. So Evelyn Washington disappeared. The woman who'd made partners at white shoe firms trembled, became invisible, taking a job that would keep her close to the law she still loved but could never practice. For 28 years she'd cleaned the halls of justice, listening to cases argued poorly, watching precedents she'd established get twisted, staying silent. She'd built a new life in the shadows. A small apartment in the Bronx, no visitors, no connections to her past. The only reminder she kept was that photograph with Justice Marshall, hidden like contraband. Every morning for 28 years, she'd looked at it before work, whispered, "I'm sorry," and tucked it away. Until today. Today, something in Richard Kensington's abandoned figure triggered a memory, not of law, but of another person left alone to face a system designed to destroy them. The news of Kensington's abandonment spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By 6 a.m., reporters had gathered outside, their cameras hungry for the billionaire's downfall. Farmer Cane faces justice alone scrolled across news tickers. Inside, the mockery was more personal. Evelyn, mopping near the prosecutor's offices, heard Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh laughing with her team. "Couldn't happen to a nicer sociopath," Walsh said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone about to destroy a career-making target. "Man's poisoned half of Africa with his affordable medications, and now he can't buy a single lawyer to lie for him." The security guards joined the spectacle, making bets on how long Kensington would last before breaking down. 20 minutes tops, Officer Rodriguez wagered. "You see him sitting there? Like a death row inmate who just realized the governor ain't callin'." They laughed, not noticing Evelyn methodically cleaning the same spot. Listening, in the bathroom she overheard two public defenders, lawyers who should have understood the importance of representation, joking about offering to defend him for $1 billion cash, up front. "Even then," one said, "I'd probably develop sudden illness. Some clients are just toxic." But it was in the small actions where the cruelty cut deepest. When Evelyn entered the courtroom to clean a routine task, she found Kensington still sitting there, hours before trial. His expensive suit was immaculate, but his hands trembled slightly as he reviewed papers he clearly didn't understand. Court staff who would normally offer water or direct lost visitors walked past him like he was furniture. The bailiff, typically professional, smirked when Kensington asked about procedure. "Maybe you should have thought about that before your lawyers grew consciences," he'd said. The cleaning woman was invisible to them all. To Kensington, lost in his crisis, to the staff reveling in his fall, to the journalists peering through the door windows. Evelyn noticed something they all missed. The papers Kensington reviewed weren't random. They were medical reports from African clinics, photographs of children, success stories from his controversial drug programs. His hands didn't shake from fear, they shook from rage at being unable to tell these stories. As she emptied the waste bin near his table, a paper fell out, a letter from a mother in Kenya, thanking him for the medications that saved her 3 children from malaria, the same medications the prosecution called reckless experimentation on the vulnerable. The final humiliation came when Mitchell Crawford himself appeared. The lead prosecutor, now silver-hailed and bearing the weight of political ambition, surveyed his former opponent's workplace with satisfaction. Evelyn's hand tightened on her mop handle. Crawford, the man who'd destroyed her career, standing in the very courtroom where she'd first made her name. He didn't recognize her, of course. Why would he? He walked past her to Kensington's table, leaned down, and whispered something that made the billionaire's face go pale. Later, Evelyn would learn what he'd said. "Your kind always thinks money makes you untouchable. Today, you learn what real justice feels like." The irony of Crawford speaking of justice while standing 3 feet from the woman he'd framed nearly broke Evelyn's composure, but she continued mopping, continued listening, continued being invisible. By 8:30 a.m., 30 minutes before trial, the courtroom filled with spectators eager to witness destruction. Kensington sat alone at a table meant for a legal team, drowning in the space. The prosecution's table overflowed with attorneys, paralegals, and boxes of evidence. The imbalance was so stark that even hardened court reporters shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't justice, it was an execution, and Evelyn Washington, who'd spent 28 years in purgatory for fighting exactly this kind of imbalance, felt something she hadn't felt in decades: the familiar fire of righteous anger, burning through years of carefully maintained invisibility. At 8:45 a.m., Evelyn found herself in the janitor's closet, her hands gripping the sink edge until her knuckles went white. Through the thin walls, she could hear the crowd gathering, the anticipation building for Kensington's destruction. Every instinct screamed at her to remain hidden, to protect the small, safe life she'd built from the ashes of her former self. She'd survived 28 years by being invisible. Why risk everything for a billionaire who'd never noticed her existence? The smart choice was obvious: finish her shift, go home, watch the news like everyone else. She pulled out the leather folder, staring at the photograph of her younger self with Justice Marshall. That woman had believed in justice, in the system, in the power of law to protect the vulnerable. That woman had been destroyed for it. Evelyn traced her finger over Marshall's inscription: "Never let them dim your light." But they had dimmed it. They'd snuffed it out entirely, left her in darkness so complete she'd forgotten what light felt like. Her nephew, now 42, with children of his own, didn't even know about his aunt's former life. She'd protected him by erasing herself. That was love, wasn't it? That was wisdom? From the courtroom, she heard the bailiff call for order. In minutes, they'd begin. Kensington would stand alone, unprepared, facing prosecutors who'd spent months crafting his destruction. Just like she had stood alone, abandoned by those who'd promised support. The parallel was too sharp to ignore. But he was a billionaire, possibly guilty, definitely controversial. She was a nobody now, a ghost who cleaned up after real lawyers. What could she possibly do? The moment of decision came with unexpected clarity. Evelyn looked at the photograph one more time, but this time she saw something different. Not just her younger self, but Justice Marshall's eyes. Eyes that had seen injustice in all its forms and never flinched from fighting it. He'd stood alone plenty of times. He'd been called worse than anything they'd thrown at her, and he'd never stopped believing that the law, properly applied, could save souls. Not just the innocent, but the system itself. Evelyn Washington straightened her uniform, tucked the folder into her pocket, and made a choice that would shatter 28 years of carefully maintained invisibility. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest act of self-preservation is remembering who you really are. Evelyn Washington entered courtroom 318 at 8:58 a.m., but she didn't enter as a janitor. Her spine straightened with each step, her shoulders squared, and by the time she reached the bar separating spectators from participants, she moved with the authority of someone who belonged. The transformation was so complete that the bailiff, who'd seen her clean these floors 1,000 times, did a double take. "Ma'am, spectators need to," he began, but Evelyn's voice cut through. Not loud, but carrying the kind of authority that made Supreme Court justices lean forward. "I invoke my right under New York Judiciary Law, Section 484, to provide emergency counsel to an unrepresented defendant facing criminal charges." The words, dormant for 28 years, flowed like muscle memory. The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Judge Patricia Hoffman, herself a veteran of 30 years, frowned from the bench. "Ma'am, are you a member of the bar?" Evelyn reached into her pocket, producing not just any bar card, but her original certification. Suspended, not revoked. "Your Honor, I am Evelyn Marie Washington, admitted to this bar in 1991. My license was suspended, not revoked, pending review. Under emergency circumstances, and with the court's discretion, I may serve as advisory counsel." The prosecution table exploded in objections. Mitchell Crawford himself rose, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something approaching fear. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This woman is a janitor in this building." But Evelyn was already moving, her voice steady as granite. "What's irregular, Mr. Crawford, is a defendant facing 180 years without representation. What's irregular is a prosecution team of 12 against one man with papers he doesn't understand." What's irregular is you speaking about justice while standing in a courtroom that's about to violate every principle justice represents. Judge Hoffman, to her credit, recognized the name. Every law student studied Washington versus Pharmacon Industries, even if they didn't know the attorney's fate. Ms. Washington approached. The walk to the bench was 20 feet and 28 years long. Evelyn felt every eye in the courtroom, but her focus remained laser sharp. At the bench, speaking quietly, she laid out her argument. Precedent, statute, constitutional necessity. Hoffman's expression shifted from skepticism to something like respect. This is highly unusual, but given the circumstances... Mr. Kensington, do you accept Ms. Washington as your advisory counsel? Richard Kensington, who'd built an empire on quick decisions, didn't hesitate. Yes, Your Honor. And with those words, Evelyn Washington returned from the dead. The next hour would become the stuff of legal legend. Evelyn, still in her janitor's uniform, systematically dismantled the prosecution's opening statement, not through dramatics, but through surgical precision. She knew every case Crawford cited because she'd been there when half of them were argued. She exposed contradictions in their evidence chain, procedural violations in their investigation, and, most devastatingly, connections between Pharmacon Industries and 3 of the prosecution's key witnesses. Your Honor, Evelyn said, holding up a document she'd memorized 28 years ago. I move to dismiss based on prosecutorial misconduct. The same actors who contaminated evidence in State versus Washington appear to have interests in this case. Mr. Crawford himself has undisclosed connections to Pharmacon Industries, the very company that would benefit most from Mr. Kensington's conviction. The courtroom fell silent. Crawford's face went white. Evelyn continued, each word precise as a scalpel. I have here from public records 17 instances where this prosecution has used tactics pioneered in a case designed to silence those who challenge pharmaceutical monopolies. The pattern is unmistakable. The climax came when Evelyn turned to the jury, citizens who'd walked past her 100 times without seeing her. Ladies and gentlemen, you're not just judging Richard Kensington today. You're judging whether justice means anything when the powerful decide someone needs to fall. You're deciding whether the law protects everyone or just those who play by unwritten rules. 28 years ago, I learned what happens when we let the system become a weapon. Today, you decide if anything has changed. Judge Hoffman's gavel fell like thunder. Case dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Crawford, please remain. We need to discuss these allegations of prosecutorial misconduct. The courtroom erupted. Journalists scrambling, spectators gasping, Crawford's team in chaos. But in the center of the storm, Evelyn Washington stood perfectly still. Her janitor's uniform a testament to every assumption they'd all made. Richard Kensington, billions to his name, stood with tears streaming down his face. Not for his freedom, but for witnessing something he'd never believed existed. Someone who'd stand for justice simply because it was right. Evelyn didn't stay for the aftermath. As reporters rushed toward her with questions, she walked out the same way she'd walked in, with dignity, purpose, and the kind of quiet power that needs no validation. In the hallway, a young black law student, an intern who'd watched everything, stood frozen. "Were you really?" she began. Evelyn paused, saw herself 28 years younger in those eager eyes. "Justice isn't about who you were," she said quietly. "It's about who you choose to be when it matters." She handed the girl her leather folder. The photograph of Justice Marshall, the only thing she'd saved from her former life. Don't let them dim your light. By evening, the story had exploded across every network. The janitor who saved a billionaire, the legal genius who'd been silenced, the system that had failed its best and brightest. But Evelyn Washington wasn't watching. She was in her small Bronx apartment, packing, not running this time, moving forward. The call from the Attorney General's office had come within hours. Full reinstatement, a formal apology, and a request to lead a task force on prosecutorial reform. She'd accepted on one condition. Mitchell Crawford's cases, all of them, would be reviewed. As she folded her janitor's uniform for the last time, Evelyn thought about the young law student, about Justice Marshall, about all the invisible people still fighting battles in silence. She'd spent 28 years believing her light had been extinguished. But light, she now understood, doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to shine again. Tomorrow, she would return to the courthouse, not with a mop, but with a mission. The system that had tried to destroy her would learn what she'd always known. True justice can't be killed. It can only be delayed. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won with noise and fury. Sometimes they're won by someone willing to break their silence at exactly the right moment. Someone who understands that true strength isn't about never falling, it's about choosing when to rise. In a world that judges by appearances, have you ever overlooked someone extraordinary?